Hi, I'm Lauren Rosendahl, and in this episode of Transformed, we're going to be looking at retention, or remembering something for the long term. Now, when it comes to retention, there are really only two basic rules. The first of which you already know, which is the more often you repeat something, the longer you'll remember. But there is a second rule, which is vastly more important, which goes like this. After every repetition, it takes longer for the next repetition to be effective. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if today I want to teach you all 5 things, I could opt to repeat those things 5 times in this video, say. And then I could call you up, let's say a week from now, and I'd ask, well, do you still remember those 5 things? And if you're anything like the average person, at that point you will remember only one of them. Or I could choose for a different approach. I could repeat those things, those 5 things once now. Then I could, let's say, call you up in 2 days and repeat them again. Then in 2 weeks and mention them once more. Then in 2 months. And finally in 6 months. Now at this time you're probably thinking, wow, this Lauren is a real stalker. But more importantly, if at that point I put down the phone for a whole other year, we're now 1.5 years down the road, and I then call you up again and say, do you still remember these 5 things? On average, you'll remember 4 of them. So basically what that means is that with the same amount of effort on your part, the same amount of time spent listening to these 5 concepts, I can either teach you 1 of them for a week or 4 of them for 1.5 years. This is a huge, huge difference. So really dealing with retention well, the difference is night and day. It's the difference between people barely remembering anything and people remembering something for a really long term, really reliably. Unfortunately, when we look at, let's say, our education system, we're not handling things quite that gracefully when it comes to retention. I mean, most people, if I were to, let's say, put a big differential equation up on the screen right now and it'd say, can you solve that for me? And it's been a while since you've been in high school, maybe you haven't, studied math or physics, then you're going to have a hell of a hard time solving that equation. You'll have forgotten all about that stuff, yet that was probably something you were taught in high school. So how come? How come you forgot all of that? Isn't that really strange? You spent a lot of time there, right? You had a ton of math classes. And the funny thing is what you will remember is how those math classes went. For example, you got, let's say, 2 books a year, 5 chapters per book, 10 chapters in all. Every chapter was about its own topic, and you got 1 topic per month. And at the end of the month, you got an exam. And the way these topics went is if you, let's say, had algebra in your first month of the first year, that topic would not reoccur until you had like month 1 of year 2 where you would get higher algebra. And then in month 1 of year 3, you'd get even more algebra and so on and so forth. And when you look at that from the point of view of the teachers, they said, well, look at what a beautiful system we've designed. You see, every year we're giving you the same amount of material every month. And every month is about its own topic throughout all the years, which we're all teaching. So we have to be pretty bad teachers if at that point we can't manage to explain, let's say, algebra well, while we're teaching it 8 hours a day and you're only studying it for maybe 1. And from that point of view, it does seem to be perfectly optimized. But the moment you think back to how retention actually works, a lot of red flags start going up, because when you take an average student and you have them repeat algebra for about a month, it takes only 2-3 months before the knowledge seriously starts fading away. And after about 10-11 months, almost everything is gone. So what happens while these teachers are thinking, while these professors are thinking they're stacking up one piece of material after another as the years go on, in fact, they're not. Almost everything that has been taught about the topic has already been forgotten by the time you get to the next year. And this is how you get to this strange situation where the teachers go like, what's wrong with Peter? Because he's in his senior year and he's not doing so good at math anymore. He's probably just not trying hard enough, because back in his junior year, in his freshman year, he was doing much better still. And the reality is that Peter hasn't gotten any worse at math whatsoever. In fact, he's gotten a lot better. The only problem is he just did not get good enough to both learn this new chapter and reconstruct those 3 other chapters that he'd long since forgotten. And in that way, actually, the vast majority of our educational system, things like high school, are essentially set up in the perfect fashion to ensure that everything you're taught is forgotten as soon as humanly possible. Which is absolutely bizarre, because if it was designed in a different way, we could guarantee you'd remember for 4, 6, maybe 8 years afterwards, instead of just those poor couple of months. And we see the same thing when it comes to corporate learning, right? I mean, how often do we send people to a class for, let's say, a couple of days and then give them a certificate that says you now know this? And that certificate is valid for a year, 5 years, maybe even 10 years. Whereas in reality, a week to 2 weeks from now, they'll have forgotten maybe 80% of what they were taught. So if you're doing any form of learning, corporate learning, if you're in education, and you're not dealing with retention the right way, you're not spreading out the knowledge, then don't count on people actually remembering anything, unless it just happens to be something that they apply every day in their job or in their life. If you want people to remember, a good rule of thumb is you need to have them actually repeat that material spread over a period, which is about half the amount of time that you want them to remember it afterwards. Which means if you're only dealing with material for a couple of days, don't expect people to remember it for much more than a week. In the next episode, we're going to look at the final learning principle, which is a really simple yet powerful one: motivation. Because if you can't stay motivated to take in the material and do the repetition work, obviously none of these tips, none of these things are going to help you in the slightest. So if you want to stay up to date, be sure to like this video and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode.